This morning we would treat of the absolute, of the perfection of God, by which He formulated the outer manifestations in their exquisite beauty and organization. The absolute, then, is the progenitor of all life. And having such a Father, how can we expect the byproduct of the Son to differ from the Father? It does not. For when the entire diorama of the cosmos is all complete, you see, and harmoniously working, and uninterfered with by human consciousness or any other consciousness except the consciousness of the Absolute, you see all of the component parts blend into one manifestation of harmonious perfection. This we call the body of God. We are intended as the Christ and as the bride of the Christ, the church, to become one with that body of God on earth. But we are not limited to the extent of the earth as this planetary orb is known. Nor are we limited to the outer physical envelope of cosmos insofar as the spiral nebulae of which we are a part is known. Nor are we limited by all of cosmos with its myriad twinkling lights into vast infinite distances. If the cosmos is infinite, which we postulate, then we must understand that this infinity manifest in the finite form of cosmos is greater than itself and passes beyond the realm of the physical manifestation into the realm of pure spirit, where we allow that infinity manifests, because spirit is infinite. So in treating of the absolute, we are going to take particular and specific note that the lives of men are usually not harmonious with this absolute. And so the duality manifests in our outer consciousness, and it of necessity promotes a spirit of separation. Man feels that he dwells in a separate field from the cosmos. This finite field of self becomes a field of self-limitation. But the question before us, is this the correct attitude? Should we consider ourselves a limited mortal person? Should we continually stress our faults, our failures, to measure up to the completeness of the absolute? We ask ourselves this question. And the answer cannot be derived from academics. The answer cannot even be derived from existentialism, from experience, or the realm of effects. The answer can only be derived from the realm of cause, and there we go back to the absolute. So from the absolute we realize with St. Paul that we live and move and have our being in Him. As certain also of your poets have also said, we are His offspring. We postulate then that the physical vehicle and even the mental vehicle and even the emotional vehicle are not primary offsprings of God, but rather, if you will, the chip of the soul, the little chip of wood cut from the parent tree, this chip of the soul, this infinite bark, is our reality. With this Jesus was concerned. He said, "What shall it profit a man if he shall gain the whole world and shall lose his own soul?" Thus producing the thought in Christian literature, by his speech, by his word, that the soul could be lost. We ask ourselves then, why can the soul be lost? Why should it be lost? If the soul is the real person, how can the real person be lost? Viewed from the divine aspect, it cannot be lost, because it belonged first to God, and it is God, and therefore it returns to God regardless of what function we may make of it. So it is not then lost to the cosmos. It is not lost to God at all. It is lost to us. It ceases to become a vehicle for self-expression. In other words, we lose our opportunity. The soul was the matrix of God that was given to us in order to help us to produce a personality made in the image of the matrix. And what is the purpose of this temporal personality that we are making in the matrix, supposedly, of the soul? It is a temporary vehicle in which we are temporarily seated until our various faculties by cosmic merit are themselves anchored in the soul and merged with it. The whole drama of the cosmos is one in which we live and move and have our being so that we can become the soul. But we cannot, flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God. There must come about and be produced the miracle of change. Change only because we are dealing with mutability now. First, the absolute comes before us, and this is immutable. We deal with immutability, and we deal with mutability. This is a duality. What then is the purpose of life? It is so that that which is mutable can be changed into that which is immutable. And we find it beautifully put by St. Paul, where he says one star differs from another star in glory. Also where he says, we shall not all sleep, but we shall all be changed. In a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, for the last trump shall sound, and the dead shall be raised. He then turns this manifestation in which we cast our entire being, this physical manifestation, this I, this me, this mind, this possessive sense, all of this as dead. Why? Because there can be no possibility of flesh and blood inheriting spirit. But there is a possibility of having a change, of the mutation taking place in ourselves that will enable this change, this wondrous change, to produce by the alchemical power of making full use of opportunity the self from a being finite to a being infinite. In other words, that which is so non-absolute becomes absolute. He mentions a moment in the twinkling of an eye, when the last trump shall sound. And I consider it somewhat of a game, because we are dealing now with human foibles in which we make ourselves in this grand chess game of life pawns to various forces. But it is only when we become pawns to the divine that we can very gladly lose ourselves or be spent, as St. Paul puts it, spent. We can be spent for God, for Christ, for reality. This reality then becomes that to which we give our all. In reality, of course, everyone says, we want a choice. We want free will. This means everything to us. Dear hearts, surely we have free will. But in one way, we have no free will. And I will cite it to you and prove it to you in a very beautiful homily. Jesus is sitting there with the disciples. To whom shall we go, Lord? For thou hast the words of eternal life. To whom shall we go? What choice do we really have in reality? When this blazing, dazzling splendor of the universe, of the cosmos, of the absolute, that brings forth the green shoot and the renewal of life on the tree, that manifests in this diadem of myriad stars shining in the sky, that is the power to cognize in the mind, is the reach of the mind, is the wondrous control of the emotional body, so that sheer joy can be experienced because it is controlled. You see, joy cannot be experienced when it is rushing as mad passion to some sordid fulfillment, but only where it is governed. Somewhere it says, and I will leap as a young hart. H-A-R-T. This is a controlled leap. It is not an uncontrolled contortion, a twist in space. It is a function, a beautiful function of divine symmetry in action, do you see? We are dealing with the Spirit, with the kingdom of God, with heaven. And the world is reaching for the culture of heaven in all of their reach, but they never touch it even, because it is always surrounded by the bedazzlement of the ego. It is a continual case of one star wanting to differ from another star in glory so that it will be thought more dazzling, more brilliant. And none of this will produce anything for us except more of the same unfortunate facets of history that have occurred down through the years, which we know full well, for we see all of the same patterns repeating themselves today. And in people, I do not actually see any difference today in the people that are in the contemporary scene than in ancient Rome, or going back into ancient Babylon, or Ur of the Chaldees. The same vanities plague and perplex us all, the same fruitless sense of continuity that we know full well is not real, plagues us. People seem to think that they're going to live forever in their present environment and stature. Yet they have witnessed the miracle or debacle of change occur in their own world all the way from the cradle on, and will till the grave comes. They will see this. Yet they talk about constancy, the constancy of the ego. I say to you today that the ego is inconstant. It has no faith at all, except it be wedded to the absolute, to God. It has no reality. It has nothing. It is a constant case of change for change's sake. Change the vibrations, change the pattern, change the environment. But always the same ego, always the same ideas, the same confusions beset us, the same struggle for recognition. when there should be no struggle for recognition, because we should, like a flower, open. And when a flower opens, this is no struggle at all. It is a natural unfoldment. And this is what man should and ought to do. He should unfold into his divinity. He should just expand and reach out for God. It's such a pure thing, such a very marvelous gift. It is a natural manifestation all the way. Yet we insist on the synthetic, and we bring about our own obsolescence. And we plan it that way, even for ourselves as people. But God wants none of it, because He does not wish His children to eat tripe, the trivial, the mediocre, the deceit that is always upon us, the falseness, the shoddiness of life. He wants us to shun it and to be real and vital people. And being real and vital people, we have the greatest joy that anyone can possibly imagine in heaven, and we have it here on earth, because I do not believe that we ourselves could stand the shift in vibrations if we were even given the ascension, moved suddenly from the pole of the ego to the pole of the divine. This in itself would disconnect all memory from us, and we would not even know who we were. Only by the gradual change in its own relative sense can we assimilate the passions of heaven, the feelings of heaven, the fire of heaven that makes us real people. Generation is good, but regeneration is better. Generation, of course, is actually a sequence that takes place in regeneration. For you have to have the natural man first in the orderly sequence. You have the natural man, and then you have the spiritual man. But of course, everyone knows that before the natural man, there was a spiritual man again. But you see, this was the absolute spiritual man, Adam Kadmon. It was the first Adam in whose image we are all created. But now we have before us the last Adam, which is the living Christ, and this is the regenerative sense, contrary completely to the generative sense. Because now all things are made new, but they always were, because this is the nature of spirit itself, to make all things new. It is simply that we ourselves have closed our eyelids in sleep. We have slumbered in the dream of self, and not realized that this dream was a cocoon, and that there the worm that was laying out was changing into the butterfly by the power of transmutation, so that he could fly into the sun and forget the cocoon born out of ignorance, which enfolded and wrapped him in his worm-like state. This is what man has done. This is what people are doing today, and this is why they are constantly changing their vibrations. They want to change. Every few years, the skirts go up or go down like window shades. It is true. Every few years, new fads in diet, new scientific discoveries are made. Something new all the time. But none of these new events have ever changed the stature of the soul. Jesus said it. He says, which of you by taking thought can add 1 cubit to your stature? We cannot fabricate through the miracle of our human senses, great as they may be, the kind of a life that God wants for us. All we have to do is accept it and unfold in it. And when we do, we have to be mindful of the need to put off the old man and his deeds. And here is where I say we have something to do. When it comes to taking the divine sense on, or being clothed with the divine sense, as Walt Whitman put it in his Leaves of Grass, we are able, you see, to clothe ourselves quite easily with the natural unfoldment of the divine sense. But it is another thing to cast off the old man and his deeds. We find this duality plaguing us at every turn of the road all the way to the ascension. The ego that feels hurt and is wounded. And I have recently come to a conclusion concerning the Illuminati. The Illuminati was spawned by a minority group. The minority group was aware of world conditions in a limited way. The minority group felt oppressed because they were a minority. And it reminded me almost of the statement I heard in Amsterdam. Why do you treat people the way you're treating them? Oh, it's the Dutch, the Dutchman said to me. I said, what do you mean it's the Dutch? He said, well, we're only a little country, and all we have is our pride. Well, that's real interesting. Perhaps that's the way of the minority groups. They're only a little country. They're only a little race. And so they feel essentially the need to attract attention. It's the same thing you see on the Sandlot. My dad can lick your dad. My mother's bigger than your mother, or she's smarter, or she's prettier. Or I'm the toughest kid on the block. What is the force that seems to make people continually argue with each other, fight with each other, fuss with each other? It's always the struggle for recognition. And this is what the whole problem of the Illuminati is. It's a case of someone like Nikita Khrushchev taking off their shoe and pounding it on the desk at the United Nations. When that shoe hit that table, people's bellies had butterflies in them all over the world. People trembled. The might of Russia was in this childish act of this overgrown tomboy, this rude child, beating his shoe on the desk, unheard of in diplomatic circles, yet powerfully effective. We see it all the time out here with children. They squall as loud as they can to get attention, because this is what people want. We find then today that humanity are brats that have never grown up into a spiritual maturity, and the Illuminati was the spawn of brats. But it is powerfully effective in creating racial divisions, in creating conflicts between geographically located countries. And everything that we see in the macrocosm, we see reduced to the microcosm in the crucible of self. We are test tubes. We know it inside. But many times we forget about it. Faced with a given situation, we are ignorant. I point out, the divine director came to me one day, I think it's in one of our pieces of literature. He was discussing with me what he called plot sequences. I was somewhat upset. We had had 3 or 4 episodes occurring at the heart center and throughout the field that had caused a lot of unnecessary trouble, and all of these things were tempests in teapots. They were all minor little things that should never have been a problem to anybody. I went to the divine director and to masters, and I was complaining about it. And he said, well, Mark, he said, I'm going to open your eyes. He said, these conditions have grown through the years and are repeated cyclically, sometimes by the same people and sometimes by other people. They're carefully preserved little plot sequences. I thought, what in the world is he talking about? And then he said to me, he said, television, programs, and movies, dramas, and so forth are almost all taken from books. The scenarios are taken from books, and every book has its plot. I said, yes, I know that. And he said, in each book that has its own plot, you will find hundreds or thousands of little small plots that make up the total story. Plot sequences. In fact, I understand that they're now in the process of having computers write books by feeding plot sequences into the computers, and the computers will put them together, and then the authors will just have to go over these plot sequences, and they can turn out books much faster than they're doing it now. And all they have to do is have the advertising copy written by splendid copywriters, and more money will pour into the organizations where they control the book industry. You know what I mean? They just rake in the money, because the books can pour off the press, and the public will sit there and pore over the plot sequences, all of which are as old as the hills. So then, what are plot sequences? They are simply little episodes that are designed like a noose or a trap to catch us, to steal our energy, and to create a disturbance. And the reason we fall into the trap so easily is because we have not grown up. Now, I can go ahead and hide this. I can conceal this. I can be the popular guy who talks about the universe and the flowers and the birds and the bees. Or I can reduce some of these things to the practical manifestations that will help us to overcome our weaknesses. Because our weaknesses are not inherent within the absolute, but they are inherent within the outer shell, the four lower bodies of man. There we find all these plot sequences literally existing between the strata of matter. You might say we have a layer, and there's your plot sequence, like the filling in sandwiches, sandwiched in between the layers of substance that make up the self in the various aspects of self. Well, what are we going to do with it? It's like having a group of pornographic books that your grandfather had purchased, and you find them up in the attic, and you're a spiritual-minded person. You make a good bonfire out of them, don't you? Are you going to sit there and pore over them because Granddaddy did, or some grand uncle of yours, or a friend who gives them to you without knowing what he's doing? You just don't do it. If you're really interested in God, you have to be glaringly honest with yourself. We cannot really kid ourselves at all. You can't point the finger at me or at anybody else and say, well, that person is to blame for my life. That isn't true at all. I'll admit that we are affected by what other people do. There is definitely a field of action and reaction, but we don't have to be controlled by it. We can be affected by it without being controlled by it. Otherwise, we are not masters of our own world, but other people are mastering us. I can give you a case in point. Supposing we have two sisters. They're little children. And one of the little sisters learns that her bigger sister cannot stand to have her hair unbraided because she's very proud of her braided hair. And every morning before she goes to school, the mother plaits this hair and makes it up beautifully and wraps it around her head. So the little sister, knowing that this bothers her to have the braids taken out, she goes, whenever she can, she gets behind her when she's sitting there watching television or doing anything, engaging, she'll gradually undo this hair very stealthily. And the first thing you know, the girl will walk off and their hair is all in braids. She comes to the mirror. Well, you see, having learned that this disturbs big sister and makes her mad, anytime she wants to get her mad, all she has to do is go through the same plot sequence, just unbraid her hair. And her whole soul comes apart at the seams, you might say, because her hair is unbraided. Whatever anathema you have, whatever bothers you, you may rest assured that the devil will find it. And he will surely see to it that somebody does it to you as long as it bothers you. And the only way you're ever going to get over it is to finally grow up and realize that you are going to be the boss. You're not going to get angry with anyone else because they do something that disturbs you. You are going to keep yourself calm, cool, and collected, and divine. Now, I'd like to compare this to electricity. A vital electricity that can absolutely alter any condition that you have in the self. I'll explain it in better words than these now. In other words, here's a giant computer up here. It's a giant computer that is programmed to the absolute. Everything that's perfect and beautiful and glorious, everything marvelous, all happiness is in this computer up here. But in order to get that into the machine of the self down here, if we're going to put this ghost in the machine, we have to plug into this big computer and wait so many minutes for the program of our life to emerge from the computer and come flowing as great cosmic electricity into the self. Now, the way it works by alignment. In other words, wherever we're disturbed, whatever the anomalies are in our world, wherever our jack straws are all out of line, they're twisted, misshapen. The moment the energies of this computer come to pass on our energy force field, everything lines up perfectly beautiful. And then you see, because everything is lined up, we are able to function the way we're supposed to, harmoniously and happy and everything. But the moment that we become disconnected from this computer, and unfortunately, we are often doing this, we walk around then and one by one these little hairs become misaligned by the winds of cross currents that come to us from other people's attempts to unbraid our hair. Sometimes they do it on purpose. Sometimes it's completely innocent. And this is the interesting phenomena in all. Supposing it is completely innocent, and we are the victims of it. And so we get fighting mad because somebody has pulled our chain. And now all of the emotional fluids in our whole emotional body must flow down the drain until we can finally get them all back in place again. Well, we are always under someone else's control, and will be until we learn to master that. So, one way of mastering it, of course, is to plug into this cosmic computer and never stay disconnected. Then, of course, you have almost an automatic invulnerability factor working for you. Because when anything happens, the minute anything turns this way or that way, the computer automatically resets it, and you never get the whole structure all into bad position. Oh, this is ideal. This is all brought out in the chart of the presence. It's there for us to use. We simply don't use it because we like to intellectually comprehend the story of the chart and all the different things the masters say to us. It's very pleasant to sit and listen to words. If you don't believe it, you know very well that from the time of P.T. Barnum and all the way down to all the old medicine men that were out there with their fire water in the circuses holding up a bottle that would cure everything, the panaceas of the world. Everybody was listening. People love to hear words. The mind devours words. It devours ideas. But it is a little chore to put the words into practice, to formulate our own decisions that enable us to use these great panaceas. Now, some panaceas are phony, naturally. They're nothing more than colored water. Of course, we could always take them as a placebo. If we took them as a placebo, we probably would cure ourselves with them. But on the other hand, when we're dealing with the masters, we are dealing with reality, you see. Isn't that beautiful? When you're dealing with a master, you're dealing with reality, you see. So, you have the real panacea here. But it isn't going to work for you any more than the phony one would, unless you put it to work. And you must not forget. And as I close my dissertation on the Absolute, I want to remind you of this. Thy seed, O God, shall bruise the serpent's head, but he shall bruise thy heel. You must understand that you can bruise the serpent's head all you want to with the Christ, but be prepared to have your heel bruised. The areas of vulnerability, the Achilles tendons, the parts of you that are not under control, the dark forces that walk amongst us in the world order and in our own personality in the swamps and morasses of our own life. They are there unless we've transmuted them. They are your bitterest enemy of all, because they are with you always, even unto the end, until you finish them. So the absolute awaits chrysalis in everyone's life. We await the coming of the absolute into our world, but we are quite the arbiter of our own destiny. Because God is always ready to give at every moment, the only delaying factor then is ourselves. Are we ready to receive? That's the whole matter. If we are ready to receive, then we don't count the cost. Because if it takes everything that we are, what we are getting is worth so much more than that we don't even see it. We throw it in the hopper without even thinking. And when we have to pause to think and weigh, almost certainly our possessiveness and our attachment for things and objects will snare us, and we'll never make it until we learn to shed it. This is why today I have discussed the absolute, which I will call the major and minor absolute. The major absolute, of course, being the perfection of God in the macrocosmic realm, and the minor absolute being the individualized life plan that God has for our world if we're ready to let Him develop us and forget our foolish attachments to ourselves. I've seen this again and again, not only in my own life, but in other people's lives. None of us can live the lives of another person. Each one is given that special privilege of living their own life exactly the way they want to live it. But I remember the words, "As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." If this is your goal, then all the wild mules down in Missouri will not pull you away from it, ever. If it isn't, none of them will kick you into it. So thank you.